battle it was set, a lord led his army out to meet the threat. Roger de Mortimer.
So, to launch, if most of us think about medieval church architecture in Herefordshire, I guess most of us think about great Romanesque achievements of the 12th century. And I start off with perhaps the most familiar of them, the south door at Hilpeck, which dates from about the 1240s, covered in this rich decoration from a whole variety of different artistic sources. What a sight. Or we might perhaps think from the same period of the Castle Frome font of the baptism of Christ. There on the left, we see Christ dipping John the Baptist dipping the Christ child into the waters of the River Jordan. Just in case you're not quite sure what's the River Jordan, there are some fish on the side to help you see that's the Jordan, and the Holy Spirit above. I think that's a terrifically powerful piece of sculpture. All the more powerful because everything being out of proportion and its semi-abstract nature, I think we're probably in a better position to appreciate it in the 20th and 21st centuries than ever before. Or another one, another font. This is the two fighting men locked in combat on the font at Ardsley. I throw this one in for pay tribute to my publishers, Richard and Sue Wheeler at Logiston, just in case they're watching this morning, because they're, of course, based at Ardsley, and they live and work from just up the street on the other side of the street from the church. So Ardsley, the two fighting men locked in combat, caught up in all these tendrils, which is one of the hallmarks of Herefordshire Romanesque. So that's Romanesque. But I'm not talking about that this morning. What I'm going to be talking about is the architecture of a slightly later period, 2 centuries later, what we call the decorated period. And you may remember that Thomas Rickman, back in the 19th century, divided English Gothic up into 3 periods. First of all, early English, the architecture of the 13th century with lancets. Secondly, decorated, roughly 1280 to up to death in 1348. And then thirdly and finally, perpendicular from the Black Death up to the Reformation. And what I'm talking about today is the second of those periods, decorated from about 1280 to the 1340s. And you can see from this slide why it's called decorated. The word describes it. It's immensely ornate. Here you're looking at one of the windows on the great show facade of the South Leominster Priory. And you can see it's got richly intricate window tracery right at the top, and then the mullions and the window surrounds are coated, encrusted with ballflower ornament. That is to say, a form of ornament, very simple, endlessly repeated, in the form of an opening flower bud with a little ball in the middle, hence the name ballflower. So you have this impression of rich encrustation, and the lines of the window, the hard lines of the window, being dissolved by the decoration. That's about 1330. Another example from a few years later, tomb monument at Much Marcle of Blanche Lady Mortimer, who died in 1347. The tomb is from a few years later. Magnificent canopied monument with coving and heraldry at the top. But what it's famous for is the naturalistic touch of the hem of the lady's dress spilling over the side and dropping down in front of the tomb chest. Marvelous piece of realism. Or in another idiom again, completely different idiom, the nave roof at King's Pile. Goodness, I remember when we went in there for the first time a few years ago, and I was absolutely bowled over by this roof, gobsmacked. It's a magnificent sight, and it deserves to be better known. And it's big as well. It stretches the full length of the nave, and then it goes round the corner into the South Chapel. Well, those are some examples, just a few examples from different artistic media of works in the decorated style in Herefordshire. And the serious study of Herefordshire decorated in modern times began with this man, Dr. Richard Morris of the University of Warwick, standing here in one of the window bays of Kenilworth Castle. He lived at Kenilworth. I say lived because sadly he died a few years ago. And he wrote the English Heritage Guidebook to Kenilworth Castle. But his Courtauld Institute thesis back in 1972 was on Herefordshire decorated. And Morris's argument briefly was that decorated architecture exploded on Herefordshire with the great rebuilding of Hereford Cathedral from the 1290s onwards, of which more in a moment. And then when the rebuilding programme at the cathedral began to wind down between 1310 and 1320, all the masons employed there began looking for work elsewhere, naturally enough. And where did they find it? They found it in building projects and rebuilding projects on the parish churches in the diocese. They moved out to work elsewhere in the diocese. And Morris argued that you could trace the movements of these men. You could trace the dissemination of their particular tastes in the decorated style by looking at moulding profiles, which were their, as it were, artistic signatures. And here are just a few to show you how the study of mouldings profiles works. You see this little V-shaped moulding, this V-shaped groove? That's on one of the window displays at Allensmore. This is next door at Madley. See the same V-shaped groove. And yet again, in the same area at Eton Bishop, the same V-shaped groove on the east window. So what you conclude from that, what you conclude from these identical mouldings on all three churches is that they were the work of the same mason. The same mason designed them. And that's the way you can trace the dissemination of variants of the decorated style across Herefordshire and South Shropshire, which made up the diocese. So what's our agenda for the next half hour, 35 minutes? I've got 4 points that I want to discuss with you. Ideally, it should be 3. I never like more than 3 points in a talk, but anyway, I can't quite do it. It's 4. First of all, why was there so much building in the decorated period? Let me stress that you get 2 great building phases in Herefordshire in the medieval period. First was the Romanesque period, the age of Kilpeck, Castle, Frome and Erdesley. Nothing much happened in the 13th century. And then you get another great building boom in the decorated period. And again, after that, next to nothing for reasons I'll explain. So the second great building boom in the central marches in the Middle Ages is in our period. And I want to ask the question, why? Secondly, who were the patrons of all this building? And I'm going to identify 3 groups for you. The churchmen, the Mortimers, obviously have to talk about the Mortimers, don't we? And members of the country gentry. Thirdly, churches don't just build themselves. The building labourers have to be paid. How is it all paid for? And fourthly and finally, when did it end and why? So to begin with my first question, why was there this great building boom in the diocese in the early 14th century? And I think to begin an answer to that question, we must begin at the cathedral itself with the account of the diocese's own saint, Thomas Cantilupe, whom Ian is going to talk about a little bit later. Cantilupe was Bishop of Hereford from 1275 to 1282, a man of austere and very upright character. And after his death in 1282, a cult developed around him. Miracles were reported at his tomb, and miracles were invoked in his name elsewhere in the diocese. For a brief time, this was the most popular cult in England, matching indeed perhaps for a while, eclipsing that of Becket at Canterbury. The pilgrims poured into the cathedral and put lots of money in the offerings box as well, more of that in a moment. The pilgrims poured in, and Richard Swinfield, Cantilupe's successor in the see on the diocese, launched a campaign for his canonization, and canonization was eventually conceded by the Pope in 1320. Were it not for the coronavirus pandemic, we would indeed be marking in a suitable way the 700th anniversary of Cantilupe's canonization this very year. But of course, the pandemic has put pay to all the plans, sadly. Well, what I want to argue now is that the cult in the diocese of Hereford's own local saint, Thomas Cantilupe, sparked an immense spiritual renewal and resurgence in the diocese. This was Hereford's own saint. People took a pride in him. It set in motion this mood of spiritual renewal, which you can see all over the place. And this in turn spilled over into church building. So that's my first point. Cult of Cantilupe brought about a mood of renewal in the diocese, which encouraged church building. And you can see this washing out across the diocese in a variety of ways. I don't know whether Ian is going to mention this one, I bet he will. Credenhill, this remarkable stained glass window in the south wall of the chancel, showing Cantilupe on the right, and England's premier saint, the other saint, Thomas Becket at Canterbury on the left. The cult of the canonization of Cantilupe is being promoted by directly associating him in this window with Thomas Becket. And this was almost certainly commissioned by the rector Philip Talbot, canon of Hereford, circa 1305. So that's my first point, the cult of Cantilupe. My second point is an entirely different one, and it's the foundation of chantries. And here I need to digress for a few moments to say a word or two about a little bit about medieval theology. Medieval theology was more concerned really with the afterlife than it was about our life in the present. It was all about what happens to your soul after your death. And the teaching of the church was that after you've died, you're not quite good enough to go up to heaven. We're not all good enough to go up to heaven, are we? We're not bad enough, I hope, to be consigned immediately to the eternal torments of hell. The souls of most of us go to a sort of halfway house called purgatory, where our souls are tried and tested before the Almighty makes his final decision as to whether we go up to heaven or down to hell. And the church further taught that the safe passage of the soul in purgatory could be assisted by the prayers and the masses offered by the living faithful. The Almighty would take notice of them, and they might help to influence him, to spare the soul, and send it on to the pearly gates of the heavenly kingdom. Well, how could people on earth prepare for this by endowing prayers and masses? Well, in the 1000s, the 1100s, and the 1200s, what the very wealthiest did was, of course, found monasteries, abbeys and priories, because what these places were gigantic storehouses of prayer. Monks saying prayers and masses in perpetuity for the safety of the souls of the founder and those others named by him. That's what the nobility and the bishops all did in the 12th century. They founded monasteries. But founding a monastery, of course, was a very, very expensive act indeed. You had to endow it. Not everybody could afford it. So what about the faithful of lesser means? What could they do? Well, in the 12th century, the answer was very little, hard luck. But by the end of the 13th century, an answer had been found to this question. Means was found by which the faithful could endow a chaplain, say prayers and masses for them at a side altar in an existing building, for example, a parish church. And this is in origin what a chantry was. A chantry was an occasion, an institution, long before it took concrete form in the building of physical chantry chapels. And I'm showing you an example here from Clihonga of a chantry chapel built on the northern side of the church to house an altar at which a chaplain would say prayers and masses in perpetuity for the safe repose of the builder, Sir Richard Pembridge, whose tomb is also in that chapel. And another example, Dilwyn. This chapel was built on the north side of the church, I think probably by the Tyrrell family. See, this is how they did it, bolting on a chapel onto the side of an existing building. And the point I want to make here is that boom time for chantry foundations, and so the boom time for the building of chantry chapels by patrons who could afford it, typically parsons, members of Knights and Gentry families, came in the early 14th century. You plot chantry foundations on a graph. It goes up and up between 1300 and 1340. Something like 1,000 chantries were founded across England in the first half of the 14th century. In other words, boom time for the foundation and building of chantries coincides directly with our period, the decorated period of architecture. And I throw in one more example. This is West Hyde, to the northeast of Hereford. It's a church that deserves to be better known. Look at this remarkable south aisle chapel built here. This is bolted on in the form of a south aisle onto a tiny Norman nave, completely overshadows the nave to the north of it, and it almost overshadows this stumpy little west tower, again dating, I think, from the 12th century. This was actually built in the early 14th century as a chantry chapel, and the tomb of the founder is inside it, but alas, there's no inscription, so we don't know who he was. West Hyde is a remarkable church. And there's one more point I ought to make, and that is, expanding on what I said earlier, the rebuilding of Hereford Cathedral. Because this, of course, was the main building project in Herefordshire at this period. So we'd better spend a moment looking at it. As a result of the great popular cult centering on the shrine of Cantilupe, the pilgrims flocked into Hereford. And of course, as I said earlier, they dropped lots of money, lots of fivers and tenors into the cathedral offerings boxes. And what did the cathedral dean and chapter do with this money? They launched on a great rebuilding program at the cathedral to give themselves a building worthy of the shrine of the new saint. So they rebuilt the aisle, rebuilt the central tower, rebuilt the eastern chapels, and they also rebuilt the now lost west tower. Of course, as you all know, the west tower fell down in 1786. So it was this rebuilding program, as I said, when talking about Richard Morris's work, that eventually, after the rebuilding program here wound down, spilled over into rebuilding of parish churches in the diocese. And it helps to explain where people got their builders. you know, as I said, churches don't build themselves. You had to get your builders from somewhere. And basically they were unemployed masons from the cathedral. So those, I think, are the three reasons why you've got a building boom in Herefordshire in the 14th century. Count of Canterlot, foundation of lots of chantries, and the rebuilding programme at the cathedral, which encouraged church building more widely and also provided the labour force. So now moving on to point two, the patrons. Who were the patrons who commissioned all these works? And I begin with the churchmen. Broadly speaking, there was a division of responsibility for church maintenance in the Middle Ages. Chancel, where the priest officiated, well, the priest himself had responsibility for maintaining that. Everything west of the chancel arch, the nave, the tower, the porch, the aisles, they were the responsibility of the congregation, the laity. So when we're looking here at this wonderful east window at Eton Bishop, this is the east window of the chancel. It was the responsibility of the parson, and it was the parson, the rector of Eton Bishop, and other people associated with him who almost certainly commissioned it. And I show it, it's an example of something else in a different artistic medium, stained glass. I show it because it is quite simply the finest surviving medieval church window in the Diocese of Hereford, and I would have thought all over the marches. It's a superb piece of work, and it has come down to us almost complete. So what are we looking at? We're looking in the main row from the left, the Virgin and Child, St. Michael weighing souls, the Bishop, the Archangel Gabriel, and then the head of a mainly now lost figure of Christ. Above the Bishop in the centre, a crucifixion, and above that in turn, rich decorative canopies. And then along the bottom, a row of donor figures. This is a close-up of the famous Virgin and Child, one of the most exquisite pieces of stained glass to have come down to us from the 14th century. What you're looking at is the Virgin holding the Christ child in her arms, and the Christ child in this lovely touch is fondling his mother on the chin. Exquisite piece of stained glass painting. And then below the Virgin and Child, one of the donor figures. And here we're looking at a close-up of the central donor figure, which is Adam Muramuth, Canon of Hereford. And I show him to you. He's in his doctor's robes from Oxford. I show him to you because he's famous in another capacity. He was a government clerk, a diplomat, and a famous chronicler. For those of us who are interested in the history of the early phases of the 100 Years' War, Muramuth's Chronicle is an indispensable source. And here we have a portrait of him. So the Eton Bishop East window is an example of patronage by the clergy, just as the earlier stained glass window that I showed you at Credenhill is likely, is almost certainly as well a commission by a member of the clergy. And I'm stretching clerical patronage a little bit here to show you the south aisle of Madley Church. What a spectacular church this is. And the south aisle here, known as the Chilston aisle, is the pièce de résistance. I'm showing it here because I think it was commissioned by the Dunry family. And the Dunry family were lords of the manor of Chilston, which was in the parish of Madley. This has always been known as the Chilston Aisle. I think it was built by the Dunry family, lords of the manor of Chilston. And the reason I'm showing you this under the heading of clerical patronage is that the Dunrys married into the family of Bishop Swinfield, Cantilupe's successor. And by virtue of their kinship with the Swinfields, they became, after his death, bearers of Swinfield family memory. We know that the Dunrys founded a chantry for the memory of Bishop Swinfield in Hereford Cathedral. And I think this is a parallel one which they founded in Madley Church. This is definitely not a chapel of the kind that was built as a burial chapel. There are no medieval tombs in it. It must have been founded for another purpose. And I think that purpose was quite simply to provide altar space for the lavish celebration of masses, the safe passage of the song of Bishop Swinfield. I now move on, not before time, to the Mortimers. We must talk about the Mortimers, mustn't we, since this is a meeting of the Mortimer History Society. And I begin with showing you a few examples of the patronage of Roger Mortimer, the first Earl himself. Now, I guess most of us don't think of Roger Mortimer, the first Earl, Queen Isabella's paramour, the virtual ruler of England from 1327 to 1330, when he was arrested and executed, as a particularly pious sort of man. I hope I'm not giving offence to people, causing any scruples, if I say I think of him as a fairly self-interested sort of man, more interested in this world than the next. But he showed a piety of an entirely conventional sort, endowing chantry chapels for the safe passage of his soul after death. This one, founded in 1327, built on the north side of Lentwardine Church near Ludlow. Here we see the remains of the chapel which he founded about the same time in Ludlow Castle, the now ruined chapel which he founded in the castle. And you see here the characteristic Y-shaped tracery, which is one of the hallmarks of Herefordshire, decorated. But there was much other church building going on in Mortimer country in the northwest of the county. This is the parish church at Alton. Chancel is of course 13th century. You see the 13th century lancets there. But the nave, full-blown 14th century work of the 1320s or 30s. Kingsland, large and very elaborate church, as you can see from its outline here. Again, dating from the 1330s, right in the heart of Mortimer country. And again, you can see a characteristic decorated window with Y-shaped tracery. Pembridge, this is my favourite. Proud and very cathedral-esque church, isn't it? Standing proud and aloof, high up in its cathedral-like churchyard, just like a cathedral close, high above the marketplace, with its famous detached tower. And because the tower was detached and you didn't need to have a tower at the west end, you could build this magnificent big reticulated tracery window. That's the inside of Pembridge. Very large, spacious interior with transepts. And here in the south transept, you can see, unusually for Herefordshire, the remains of some painted decoration. Tanya is going to be talking to us about painted decoration later. I think it's worth putting down a marker for her talk to say that although these churches today are all very bare inside, they were originally richly decorated, not only with stained glass of the kind that I've shown you, but also with painted decoration, of which that is a rare survival in Herefordshire. Pembridge is a particularly big church, particularly grand and ambitious. And I want to stress the point, Pembridge, Kingsland, and some of the others are big, expensive churches. Forget any idea that the parishioners could have paid for these places. That's nonsense, forget it. What you have here is churches built by a very rich patron. And who was the patron? They date from the 1330s. It can't have been Roger, he's had been executed. He's had his head chopped off by now. What you have to do is look at the landholding evidence and ask who owned these manors in the period in question. And the answer is Lady Margaret Mortimer, Earl Roger's mother and the widow of Edmund Lord Mortimer, who died way back in 1304. And she enjoyed a long, Lady Margaret, that is, enjoyed a long and very prosperous widowhood right down to her death, 30 years after that of her husband in 1334. And I want to suggest that it's almost certainly she I don't think there can be any doubt about it. It is she who was the patron for the rebuilding of Pembridge and Kingsland. These are expensive jobs. So it begs the question, why did she splash out on building them? There were doubtless other things she could have spent her income on. Well, I think the first part of the answer is that Lady Margaret actually lived on these manors. We know that there was a Mortimer Castle immediately south of Pembridge Church. There's a good picture of it by Bob Anderson in Philip's book on the Trail of the Mortimers. There was a castle at Pembridge. There was likewise one at Kingsland. Here we're standing just outside the west tower of Kingsland Church and looking west, and we're gazing out over the earthworks, the surviving earthworks in that field of the now lost Kingsland Castle. So Margaret lived on these manors. She lived part of the time at Pembridge. She lived part of the time at Kingsland. She would naturally have taken an interest in these two parish churches. After all, just look at the proximity. These churches were virtually at the castle gates. I think she would have regarded them as pretty well amounting to castle chapels. And, sorry, we're going the wrong way, grandiose castle chapels. The point here is that she would have seen them as theatres of display, theatres for the display of Mortimer power. Remember, the stained glass windows were filled with heraldry. And we know from the antiquarian record from the 17th century that Mortimer heraldry figured prominently. Some of it survives at Kingsland in the east window. It's all gone at Pembridge. But at Kingsland, we can see what it would have been like. Coats of arms all over the place of the Mortimer family and of the families they married into. Now, another striking feature of churches of Mortimer country, you can see some examples here, is the series of carved heads. Again, probably of the Mortimer family, people associated with them, and in some cases, probably of the King and Queen. But I think in stressing the churches as theatres of display for Mortimer power, I may be giving an impression that Lady Margaret's piety was entirely self-interested as well, a bit like Earl Roger. And I wouldn't want to suggest that at all, because I think there was a more altruistic side to her character. An intensely felt piety is a characteristic of quite a number of long-lived, wealthy, aristocratic widows in the Middle Ages. Another well-known example is Alice de la Pole, Duchess of Suffolk, who survived her own husband by 30 years. And she was responsible for rebuilding New Elm Church and building the remarkable set of almshouses known as God's House, immediately adjacent to New Elm Church. Well, to the best of my knowledge, Lady Margaret didn't found any almshouses in Herefordshire, or at least not that we know of, not that are in the historical record. But what she did do was splash out on these magnificent parish churches. That was her form of this finely developed piety that you find late medieval widows cultivating. She would have seen these churches, I think, in some sense, as an adornment to the parish. Suitable surroundings for the suitably magnificent celebration day by day of the church's liturgy. I now move on very, very briefly to one example to show the patronage of church building by members of the country gentry, the knightly families. And this is another of my favourites, Little Hereford, on the banks of the River Teme near Tenbury Wells. The name Little Hereford, curious one, it's because the Delameres, who were the lords of the manor here, the Delameres, held the manor from the diocese. So it got this name Little Hereford. But the Delameres were also retainers and associates of the Mortimer family. And Sir Peter de la Mare, in the second half of the century, was the first Speaker of the House of Commons. He was Speaker of the Good Parliament of 1376, at the very time when he was steward of Edmund Mortimer of March. So he was the first Speaker, the lineal ancestor, as it were, of Lindsay Hoyle today. But this rebuilding of the chancel dates from 50 years before him. I guess again it's about 1320s. And what you're looking here is these two superb tomb recesses of earlier members of the family. I think this chancel was built very much as a mausoleum with family burials in mind. And you can see its rather proprietorial character when you turn around and look west. And you see this tiny, much earlier 13th century chancel arch. Isn't it tiny? Note they did not go on to rebuild that. They wanted to keep it tiny because this chancel was the de la Mare's own space. It was their own private burial chapel. And I think the two curtains there just about sum it up for me. I think it's wonderful that they've got those curtains there because it shows how the de la Mare's would have regarded this place. Pull the curtains across, presumably they're there now to stop the draft, and you've got a private chancel. That's how the de la Mare's regarded it. It's where they were all buried. That's enough on patrons. I'm now going on to my third heading, which is how was it all paid for? Who paid the bills? Where did the money come from? And I'm illustrating it by giving you this example again of Lady Margaret Mortimer. From evidence in the Public Record Office, the National Archives in Paul Driver's place, from her Inquisition post-mortem of 1334. And I want you to look at the value of her manors. This, of course, is 14th century money. Erdesland brought in an annual income of £34. Pembridge, £53. Kingsland, £59. Alton, £60. Henton, just over £4. And Wigmore, the great lordship of Wigmore, a whopping £129. And over the border into Wales, Radnor, £59, Prestige, 10, which I think, my sums may be not always very good, but I think that tops up to £405. That is a heck of a lot of money. And let me put it in some sort of perspective for you. The threshold for being a knight in this period was £40, 40. £40, you could become a knight. And her annual income is 10 times that. She was a very, very wealthy woman. Remember, she had a jointure of the entire Mortimer estates. That is to say, her widow's portion was well over half of the Mortimer estates. Notice that she's got the lordship of Wigmore itself. For 30 years, she had the lion's share of the Mortimer estates, shutting out Earl Roger, who had to make do with Ludlow and the lands around there. She was very wealthy. That's how she could afford church building. And on top of that income, she would also have had a separate income from the sales of wool. This was boom time for English wool exports, and the hills of Herefordshire and the Welsh Marches were one of the prime sheep grazing areas of England. Now, sales from the wool clip are not included in these figures. Wool was always disposed of separately in the Middle Ages by the central receiver directly to the Italian or Flemish purchasers. So she would have had an entirely separate income. Over and above this, let's chuck in another £100 from wool sales, giving her a potentially total income of £500. These figures help to explain the church building on the Mortimer estates, and particularly the sheer scale of the churches of Pembridge and Kingsland. I've gone on for too long and I must finish. And my final theme is, when did it all end and why? And my point of departure here is taking you, as Jane and I did 2 or 3 years ago, in a glorious spring day in May, to Richard's Castle, one of my favourite marcher churches, enormously atmospheric, high up on its hill, in the bailey of the castle, overlooking the valley below. You can see if you catch the right time, the blossom there is gorgeous. And you step inside, it's redundant now, it belongs to the Church's Conservation Trust, and it's enormously atmospheric because unrestored. It's a 14th century church, but the bits date from different phases in the 14th century. Here, this is work of the 1320s. Wallflower, you've got a close-up of wallflower there. But I'm going to take you along the nave, turning left, to have a look at that arch there. This arch, you see, sorry, the capitals on this pillar more strictly, are completely different. That's wallflower of the 1320s. Here you've got castellated capitals of the second half of the century, which are more properly perpendicular. Here in the north chapel of Richard's Castle, you are right on the cusp between decorated and what Pevsner calls perp. And look at those windows on the side, they're completely perp. This is after the Black Death, 1350, 1360. And I show you this because Richard's Castle North Chapel is one of the very, very few works of the period after the Black Death in the Diocese of Hereford. My point here is quite simply, the Black Death killed church building in the marches, stone dead. Surely we needn't say any more than that. The builders, the masons had all been carried away by the plague. They didn't have test and trace in those days. And of course, landlord incomes collapsed as well because rents collapsed. You've got nobody paying rents. So you've got no builders and you've not, people couldn't afford it anyway. That is why church building came to a sudden grinding halt in the Diocese of Hereford at the time of the Black Death. Now it's fair to say, of course, in some parts of the country, building recovered. We know full well it did. And the places where building recovered were where the cloth trade developed. The western slopes of the Gloucestershire Cotswolds, Wiltshire, Somerset, over in East Anglia. In all of these areas, a flourishing cloth trade developed, and that provided a new source of wealth for church building. But with a few exceptions, that was not the case in the Welsh marches. Yes, cloth trade developed at Leominster, and yes, it did in a few other places, notably, oh, I'm sorry, before I go on to that, this is another example of church building grinding to a halt after the Black Death. They started rebuilding, this is Northborough near Peterborough, a different part of the country. They started rebuilding this South Chapel, then the Black Death struck, and they never got round to rebuilding the nave, which is so overshadowed by its chapel. So church building ground to a halt all over the country, but in some places it revived. One place it revived, of course, was Ludlow. So Ludlow is a rare exception in providing an overwhelmingly spectacular example of 15th century rebuilding in perpendicular. What you've got here is the remaining north aisle from the decorated period that dates from the 1310s or 1320s. But apart from the porch from the other side, the rest of Ludlow is perpendicular. That's a rare example of an almost complete perpendicular church in the marches. Elsewhere in Herefordshire, hardly any. 2/3 to 3/4 of all Herefordshire churches date from the period I'm talking about now, the decorated period. And that is because they were never rebuilt, because the money was not paid for, the money was not there to pay for the rebuildings. No rebuildings. Herefordshire's churches are mainly decorated. And I say, thank goodness for that, because they're decorated in glory.
Paul, I think you have a couple of questions for Nigel.
I certainly do. So, Nigel, brilliant. Thanks so much for that. How do we, this is a question from Jonathan Hopkinson. How do we identify the patrons for the series of 15th century decorated roofs in North Herefordshire, South Shropshire and Powys, please?
That's a good question, very good question. Very difficult to find out who the patrons were. very difficult indeed. There isn't a simple and a straightforward answer to the question, I'm afraid. But the point is made there that you do find expenditure on furnishings, if not on physical building. What I was talking about just now was physical building. Furnishings, the spending on furnishings does, of course, continue. I think, for example, of the screen at St Margaret's in the south of Herefordshire, and roofs have already been mentioned. One solution is to find out who the lord of the manor was, and that involves looking at the history of landholding. Another source I use a lot is wills. See if you've got any people from your village, from your area, who've got wills in the National Archives Prob 11, Prerogative Court of Canterbury Wills, which you can view on the National Archives website online. Broadly speaking, I'm thinking here of lay patronage, up-and-coming lesser landowners, perhaps, who were more important as a source of patronage in the 15th century than lords of manors were in my period, the 14th.
Brilliant. Yeah, I've just to say, by the way, that the wills on the National Archives website are currently free to download. So you can download them as many as you like for free. I had a question, if you don't mind. Since nobody else has submitted a question, I would like a question, please. Margaret Mortimer. I mean, she is such an important figure, and you didn't really touch on her political role, particularly in the 1320s. I know you were talking about the architectural side, but I mean, this is a woman who is basically the last Mortimer standing for several years in England. She's supposedly at the heart of these conventicles, rebellions against Edward II. She's, you know, sent to Elstow Abbey in Bedfordshire for her naughtiness. Do you not think that has some impact on her later pious activity? Maybe it's only a thought.
I think that's a very good point. It's worth noting that on stylistic evidence, Pembridge and I've got another question coming up on the screen about King. I was going to say that it's worth remembering that her church building on those two very spectacular churches at Pembridge and Kingsland is dated on stylistic grounds to the 1330s, no earlier, even though she's had the jointure for 20 years already, but she only really gets going on church building in the 1330s. And the evidence of masons' marks at Pembridge shows that Pembridge was completed in a very short time, in about 4 or 5 years. That's very unusual and very remarkable. And it's a comment on how wealthy she is. Paul, you're the expert on Margaret's political career. All I can say is that I haven't discussed the book, but you've made a very, very good point. And I entirely agree with it. What she's providing is a visible reassertion of Mortimer power. And I think another point I should make is that it's worth remembering that in the 1330s, the Earl is a minor. You've got a long minority. You've got political eclipse followed by a long minority, the familiar story of the Mortimers in the 14th century.
I mean, technically, of course, the earldom has gone. You know, there is no earl until 1354. So anyway, sorry, there are a couple more questions. Kate Andrew asked, who paid for the battle chapel at Kingsland?
By which I take it you mean the Vonker Chapel. That's probably Walter Mortimer, who was a parson of the church. If the question refers to the little Vonker Chapel, which is its popular nickname.
I think you will do, Nigel.
Yeah, Vonker Chapel has a tomb, but it's another of the ones without an inscription. But the general assumption is that it's Walter Mortimer, who was a parson of the church at that time, and that it's his own little private chantry chapel. So it's a private chapel built by a different patron, but it's notable that it is almost certainly another expression of patronage by a member of the Mortimer family.
Okay, well, I've got quite a broad question now from Andy King. What evidence is there for the cost of church building?
Well, I've written another book which discusses that, but I'm not going to be a bore and just sit here promoting my own work. But short answer to the question is that in 1400, you could build a complete church for £100. The one building in England for which we've got a contract for the whole job and a price tag on it is Catterick, as in the famous army camp in North Yorkshire. And that cost just over £100. It's a pretty unadorned job. It's an economy job. If you ask me to put a price tag on Pembridge, I would say that would clock in at nearer 200. So that's 4 times the threshold for the annual income of a knight. But remember that Margaret's entire annual income is likely to have been between 300 and 400. Space Pembridge over 4 years, she could easily afford it. But a short answer, an entire church, £40, £100. An aisle, £20.
Philip, have we got time for one more, or would you like to move on?
Yes, I think we could just squeeze in one more.
Okay, well, the next one I've got is from Connor Williams, who says that, Nigel, you mentioned in your book, and you mentioned briefly in the presentation about the country gentry as church builders. Recent historiography has been split about the existence of county communities as a true political and social force. Does the nature of church building by county gentry in Herefordshire suggest that we could argue there was an inclusive county community in Herefordshire?
A qualified no to that, because I think it's an expression of piety in the diocese as opposed to the county. It spills over into Shropshire. To the extent that the county community in Herefordshire partly but not completely overlapped with that of the Mortimer retinue, I would say yes, you've got an expression of lay local solidarity. And it is notable that in my period, the bulk of the church building is in the north of the county, in Mortimer country, more than it is in the south. But on we are looking here at a focus of loyalty on the diocese, a pride in the patron saint of the diocese. So it spills over as well into South Shropshire. You get other decorated churches, which I haven't mentioned because I was short of time, at, for example, Chelmarsh, another Mortimer church, Stodderston, and 1 or 2 other further north. And of course, Ludlow, though much of the decorated work at Ludlow was, as you saw, obliterated in the 15th century. And I saw a brief one up in the chat box from a former curate at Clihonga. And I did want to say, Clihonga is well worth visiting. Clihonga is very important and it's a very good church from this period. And it has one of Herefordshire's best tomb effigies in Sir Richard de Pembridge. In that chapel, in that chantry chapel which I showed you, tomb effigy of Sir Richard Pembridge, patron and builder, which is from the same workshop, the same school that did the famous Blanche Grandison monument at Much Markham.